Hello everybody, SlimKirby here, and I'm going on a long journey of trying to complete every single Game Boy Advance game in North America. This is the story of the highs, the lows, and all the silly stuff in between for the Game Boy Advance completion experience. This is GB Ace. Game number 25, Monster Rancher Advance. You know, I could have gotten Pokemon, Digimon, or heck, even one of the 10 Yu-Gi-Oh games on the list. But here we are, before all of those, doing a Monster Rancher game of all things. Yeah, I will never take the wheel for granted whenever we get a hype game, that's for sure. Monster Rancher Advance was released in November of 2001, so yes, another very early GBA game, and it was both published and developed by Tecmo. Now, this is interesting because I didn't actually know this at first, but initially I had thoughts that this was just a license based on the 1999 anime Monster Rancher. But after doing some research, the Monster Rancher video game franchise actually started first. The anime, which I was more familiar with, was actually made after the first video game was made in 1997 on the Sony PlayStation. Yeah, I really didn't know that. Although I honestly shouldn't have been too surprised, considering Pokemon had a similar story as well, but I feel like that's a little more well known as opposed to this case. But yeah, I'm definitely more familiar with the anime here as opposed to any of the games, but even then, I wouldn't say I'm really that familiar with the anime either. I know it came on before or after Digimon on some of the networks it was on, but I think I've only seen like an episode or two in full, and you can believe that I don't remember a thing about them, so please, no attempts to Monster Rancher bond with me in the comments section. You'd likely get better discussions with a brick wall, and you can believe me on that. So, Monster Rancher is, as you might expect, another monster raising simulation game. Although maybe not to the same extent as Pokemon or Robopon, which were more RPG adventure based. In fact, I think a better game to compare this to is actually the first Digimon World game on PlayStation, where it's less about going on an adventure, but more about how you train and what you do with your individual monster with that training. Remember the old Tamagotchi virtual pets? Yeah, you kinda have to treat the gameplay of this game more like that, which is probably hard to imagine at this point, but trust me, it'll make more sense the further we get into this summary. As for the basic plot of this game, the story follows two young adults, Aroma and Zest, who are taking care of a monster breeding ranch all on their own. The ranch actually used to belong to their parents, but when they passed away very early in life, it forced the two kids to get by on their lonesome. Since those days, what used to be a well-established ranch fell on some very hard times, and now they have sought after the help of a professional monster breeder to get the ranch back on track. And that is where you come in, because you are now in charge of making the most vital decisions when it comes to how you train the ranch's monsters and potentially lead them to victory in various tournaments until they become the strongest and most powerful monster of all time. Before we do anything though, we have to first create a monster. Now, the premise of the series before this game was spinning discs, and since the PlayStation used CD-ROMs, you could actually use random CDs or discs that you had lying around in your house to summon the monsters for this game. Kind of a neat touch, honestly. However, since this is the Game Boy Advance and the GBA uses cartridges, yeah, things had to be a bit different here admittedly. So instead of CDs, words will be used to create our monsters, and I decided to use a random word from my chat in the creation of our first monster buddy. Of course though, we only had a 4-character limit, a limit that gets expanded the more progress we make in the game, and apparently most of my chat didn't know how to count to 4. So we got stuck with my friend Odinspac's suggestion of the word woke. Yeah, thanks a lot, Odin. But hey, it's 4 letters, so woke it is. We created a blue dinosaur for our first monster, also known as Palasolo. However, because its method of generation wasn't cursed enough, we had to give it a nickname, so say hello to Wokasaurus. I mean, I really have no right to be cringing here. I allowed this atrocity to happen, but still, looking back on it now, I still wonder what the F was I thinking. Anyway, what do we actually need to do here with Wokosaurus? Well, essentially each in-game decision takes place during 1 week of the calendar. You can choose to train, rest, battle, or go on some special training, which actually takes an entire month off the calendar, but it's basically a larger training session that can potentially yield some additional rewards. You can also go to the item shop where you can buy or use specific items at your disposal, or head into town to do management of a larger scale, which I'll talk more about later. This is essentially where you go to generate monsters, though. These two options don't waste time here on the calendar, so don't worry about that, but it is worth knowing. Getting back to the ranch options, training will basically allow you to train one of your 6 different stats: strength, defense, intelligence, speed, accuracy, and life, which is basically your HP. All the other stats should be pretty obvious, but I will admit I wasn't 100% sure what intelligence did in the context of this game at first, as it really just wasn't that clear to me. I think it had to do with the type of attack you used, as some attacks relied more on strength while other ones relied on intelligence, but I was never really 100% sure. Anyway, you choose a training mission, and if you succeed, your stats will increase by a bit. There's also heavier training sessions you can do as well, which will greatly increase one stat and slightly increase another, but also make another stat drop a little as a trade-off, so be careful on how you maximize your stat gains. If you don't succeed in your training, it will pretty much be a bust and a waste of time, so pray that it doesn't happen. There's also special training, as I mentioned earlier, and like I said, the special training actually takes a month of time away, and actually costs quite a bit of your money to take on as well. Do this only if you feel like you have enough funds, and if there isn't a battle event coming up that you need to pay attention to, because you'll pretty much skip all the stuff that would happen otherwise. You also have to fight a teacher at the end of this special training. You technically don't need to win the fight though, as if you take the training you should still get some good stat boosts no matter what, although if you do win the fight, you will get a greater distribution of stats, so it's definitely good to try and succeed in these battles regardless. As for the battling, when you select this option, a schedule will pop up with the entire calendar, and you can look ahead to see what tournaments are on the horizon. You can only participate in tournaments that are at your current skill level, and the only way to increase your skill level is by winning a standardized official tournament, which happens every couple of months. There will not be a tournament every week, so you kinda need to set up your training and resting in a way where you make it so you make the best use out of your training before each event, while also making sure you rest the week beforehand, just so your monster isn't too tired for the tournament week. I'll get into battling a bit later, but thought it was worth explaining the basics first of the schedule gimmick. Doing battling or really any kind of training will also increase the amount of fatigue that your monster will have, so every now and then it's advised to use a week to rest just to make sure your buddy stays in tip-top condition. If you push it too hard and let its fatigue increase too much, it may actually get sick, so make sure you don't let that happen. Also, the more fatigue it has, the more likely it will struggle in battle too, so also keep that in mind. Now that we've covered the basics here, it's time to highlight the completion goal for this game. To beat the game and draw the credits, we need to beat the Emperor Cup, which is a tournament that becomes available after beating 4 special tournaments after beating the official tournament for the S-rank class. Yeah, we have a lot of work to do, but brace yourself, it's probably even more work than you might even realize. In theory, you would probably just think, okay, well, as long as we just keep grinding, we'll eventually get to the goal, right? Well, about that. For those who had Tamagotchis growing up, you know they won't last forever, and the same pretty much goes for these monsters too. At a certain point in a monster's life cycle, they will no longer be optimal for battle, and as a result, they may not be good enough for the endgame stretch. So, because of this, you might and will likely be training a lot of monsters during the course of this playthrough. assuming you don't have a guide to help you out along the way, because if you haven't figured it out yet, each time you start with a new monster, you will have to start from rank D again, and attempt the ranking to S. Yes, this is quite the process indeed. Now, you're probably thinking, well, does it at least get easier whenever I raise a new monster? Well, technically, yes, it should. As your ranch gets more accolades, you get the ability to use more characters in your monster generation, and you can actually combine the traits of two different monsters together to get a second generation child that has even better stat possibilities than the parents. Also, if you keep winning tournaments and events, you will likely have a lot of money, which could help by getting special training even faster, or even get some more helpful items. So yeah, while your new monsters will unfortunately have to start from scratch, the journey never really starts from square one. You just kind of have to figure out the mechanics along the way. As for battling, to be honest, I'm still not even 100% sure how this is supposed to work, but I'll try to give it a shot at least. The basic idea of the battle system here is that each monster has 3 set attacks: a near hit move, a mid-range move, and a long-range move. The closer you are, the more accurate the move should in theory be. But in general, certain moves have different attributes, like the accuracy, damage values, and the amount of guts you need to activate it. Guts is basically like MP, where if you don't have enough of it, you can't use the move, but it does count up over time during the course of a battle, so don't worry about running out of it immediately, although you may have to regain a lot of it if you want to use your stronger moves. Also, apparently the more guts you have, the more often you'll hit your opponents. There is a percentage meter at the bottom, which generally tells you the likelihood of that move working, but I think the guts value contains a hidden multiplier or something that can affect the hit rate and accuracy, so keep that in mind. The goal is, of course, to knock out your opponent by using moves to deal damage until their HP bar gets to 0. However, don't be surprised, especially early on in a life cycle, if you time out during these fights, because it's very common. If that happens, whoever has the greater percentage of their HP remaining will be the winner of the battle, so do your best to deal as much damage as possible in those cases. This battle system is weird. It's almost like you're in a constant state of tug-of-war with your opposition, trying to move yourself to the right range to use a specific attack, while also staying out of the range when they can do the most damage to you. Sometimes it's unavoidable though, so you just kind of need to hope and pray you set yourself up for success enough, and that the odds are ever in your favor, because, yeah, admittedly, a lot of these battles will feel very luck-based, to a very large degree too, might I add. So how did Wilkosaurus' journey go? Well, seeing how this was my first monster, I honestly didn't expect anything tremendous. In fact, I didn't really even know what to expect, because I was pretty much going into this game blind with as little guide usage as possible, at least for this first monster run. So yeah, little Wokey here had a pretty difficult life cycle, not gonna lie. He had several tournaments in a row where he just couldn't quite clinch the victory, either losing in the first round, forcing a 3rd place at best, or just coming up short of the crown. He never got dead last, which was nice, but it was definitely very slow going at first. It also didn't help that I probably didn't make the best use of my training. I wouldn't find this out until later, but apparently trying to max out all of your stats at once, or to be more accurate, trying to balance all of the stats, is not a good strategy for success in this game. You need to focus on your monster's greatest strengths and go all in on those. That way, when you do start getting into monster breeding, or combining, or whatever, you can combine 2 monsters with different strengths together and have the next generation at least start from a more advantageous position, one that could allow them to advance through the early stages faster and make better use of the rewards from the later stage tournaments. I did not start with this mentality though, and although I wouldn't say my stats were balanced, I definitely focused on raising some of them when they were already pretty low, and I could have made better use of my time by just going all in on the ones that did matter. I also took a special training event very early, which was also not very smart of me. These training sessions cost $3,000 of your money, and you start with $5,000. However, if you wait for a specific event, sometimes there will be discounts on these trainings, which makes them only $1,000 instead. By taking the $3,000, I put myself in a very big hole with my finances, and there were a couple of months where I either didn't have a lot of money for food, or in some cases, no money at all, and the only way for you to get cash is by either getting first or second place in tournaments. So yeah, Wokosaurus did actually live in poverty for a bit. However, try not to look at this situation as a form of pity, because, my god, this dino seriously fought his heart out to get us out of this financial stupor. I seriously feared that I was heading for a dead game here, because I couldn't feed him, something you have to do at the beginning of each month, by the way. I couldn't afford any special training, and my stats, like I said before, just weren't great enough to get a tourney win. However, I still tried to train as much as I could. I waited for each tournament to become available, and participated in all that I could, and miraculously, my money started to increase again, once I started getting a couple of wins. Heck, I even advanced out of D rank into C rank, and even later into B rank, so at the very least, progress was being made. I wasn't sure how much time I had left with my dino, but at least I learned a lot from this initial run, that's for sure. One notable thing that happened was that I actually ended up losing a tournament match by literally 0.01% of health. You gotta be kidding me. 1 HP. B rank wasn't where Wokosaurus' career ended, though. I did continue fighting the good fight with him for a bit longer, pretty much for the rest of that particular calendar year, actually. I also ended my first session before this ending stretch, and did learn a few things in between streams of this, just for safety's sake. In addition to learning about the ultimate goal of how to obtain the credits, I also came to the sad realization that this game was unfortunately going to be a grind to get through. Sure, there is a speedrun of this that is only 3 hours long, and I did have that in my back pocket if I felt like I would ultimately need to exploit something for this playthrough. But just in general, beating this game on your first generation monster, highly unlikely, and if anything, you're very delusional if you think otherwise. And my second stream session was gonna be the evidence of this. I did actually make it to S rank using the powers of Woke, and yes, I'm still very ashamed that those words came out of my mouth. Do not worry, the bit will end soon. However, getting to this rank did not come without difficulty. The foes I was contending with were stacked. Even though I had trained my attack to be really high to this point, it was still a ways away from its max value, and the enemies I was starting to fight against trounced me in every other stat. I pretty much had to get lucky with a strong hit and pray that I wouldn't get retaliated against, or if so, my decent defense would at least give me a buffer of some kind. It actually got really bad during one of my attempts for my graduation in the S-Class, where I won every fight except the last one, but then got massacred by a golem enemy. And if you go down in a tournament fight, your monster can be declared injured, which means they can't compete for the rest of the championship, basically giving the rest of your matches automatic losses. Thankfully, it was the final fight though, so I didn't get punished in that way, and still got credit for second place. But now my monster was injured for a few weeks, so I missed out on a few last training sessions. Also, I should mention this for not only tournaments, but also training sessions as well. If you actually reset your game in the middle of a tournament or training session, even as you see the result of it, when you reload your game, you will actually be at the ranch before you made your choice, essentially giving you free infinite retries if you don't get the result you want. Trust me though, you do not want to rely on this for getting through the entire game though, because some fights are just going to be near impossible to try and pray for a luckier outcome. Believe me, my next monster will be proof of that. But still, this was a trick that I did and will continue to make use of, because, come on, why not? By the end of year 4, I got a message that basically declared that Wokosaurus' days of fighting were officially over. Kinda. I could still use him if I had any loose ends I could take care of, but any training he would do would not yield any more stats, so he was pretty much done here. And trust me, these are stats that would not work for the final boss, so we officially had to retire him here no matter what. I should emphasize, though, we're only retiring him from competing, not coaching. That's right, we can actually use Woke to our advantage by making him a training coach instead. And let me tell you, a monster you raised has way more potential than the default coaches you have. Seriously. I actually retired one of the coaches we already had in place of Woke, and immediately I noticed a huge difference in my stat gains from his lessons in particular. It just depends on what gym you set him up for and the stats they have for that particular area. This is another way that future monsters will have better success in making it further in this game, so I was honestly happy to see this come into play despite my initial disappointment in starting over. If anything, it just meant that my journey to completion will just take a bit longer, but alas, that's just the way it goes sometimes in this challenge. Some games were just meant to be longer than others, I guess. I actually ended up creating 2 more monsters after making Woke a coach. The first was a dragon, a special monster I actually unlocked by winning an invitational match after making it to A rank. And believe me, you have to earn this too, as the game will actually not even accept the password you have to type in until you win the actual invitational battle that's associated with it. I named the monster Big Red, and it did actually seem like he had some pretty good stats to start with too. But I wasn't ready to fully gamble on him yet, as I had a different plan in mind. I looked up some generic passwords to get a particular monster I was interested in, and that was actually the Golem class. I had so many matches during Woke's tenure that ended up with him losing to a Golem. Not only are these guys strong, but they're really tanky too, so I thought, hey, maybe they could give me the security I need to make some good progress, or at the very least, a monster I could get max strength with to give even better strength to other monsters. I also named him LT Smash, or Lieutenant Smash, based on one of my favorite one-episode Simpson characters.
Who are you?
Oh, you'll find out in due time.
Well, it says here your name is LT Smash.
The time has come. I'm LT Smash.
Smash's tenure was, and pun not intended by the way, a bit of a rocky start to say the least. Yeah, he could put up some really good damage and take a few hits in return, but damn, he could not hit for crap, and was just really slow in general. I mean, makes sense, that's the deal with bulky characters like this, but no, I needed to alter my strategy a bit more for the long game. I had to see this less as the run to beat this game, and more like a run to help my eventual final run be easier. This was confirmed in chat by Kathram, another GBA challenger I met during some of my streams of this game. Funnily enough, they actually started their challenge not long before me, and actually did this game before I did, so they actually helped me in formulating some more strategy for this. And trust me, if you're listening to me right now, Ram, I really appreciate it, because I think this game would have been a lot more frustrating without you. As a result, I needed to basically look at Smash's career as 2 main objectives. 1, max out strength, and 2, get at least B rank, since that is the rank the monsters need to be at in order to become coaches. Then, I basically had to replace the default coaches with these monsters instead. That way, when I use my true champion, they will get the best training possible, and I should theoretically be able to get good stats across the board. That's the plan anyway, and as you can probably see, yeah, this could take a while. Essentially, in order to make this work with Smash, I needed to increase his horrid accuracy first, because, yeah, even when getting his guts high during the battles, he was still only having like a single-digit % chance of hitting whenever I attempted an attack with him. And let me tell you, even if the enemy does only 2 HP of damage to you, if you do nothing, you're still going to lose, because 100% health is still higher than 99.7. I did have a funny incident though, where I actually had a tie match between another Golem opponent, and it actually went into a further tiebreaker condition where I guess it looked at the amount of guts used or something? Honestly, I'm not sure. But apparently that was something Ram hadn't seen in their run either, so it was nice to at least take a gander at. Anyway, I raised Smash's accuracy a bit, kept him fighting for more experience and money, even learned some really good attacking moves from special training, and kept the ball moving with increasing his strength more and more. As I progressed further into the legacy of LT Smash, I finally made it to the B ranks, so at that point all I had to do was just keep on increasing my strength until he was done with his fighting tenure. I still participated in tournaments and special training, just because that would give further boosts to other stats and funds for future fighters, and as I got stronger and won more, before I knew it, I was actually back in S rank in like half the time it took Woke to get there, which really surprised me. When strength was maxed, the initial plan was to work on defense as a secondary trait, but I actually had a change of heart and started working on accuracy instead, just because it was becoming really obnoxious to hit certain enemies. Eventually I beat the S-Class official tournament, and then something suddenly dawned on me. There was actually a non-zero possibility that Smash could maybe beat this game for me. The chances weren't that great, but I don't think it was a bad idea to at least try, you know? Besides, I could keep steamrolling the official tournaments, and every now and then get a few of the invitational scrimmages as well, which I did unlock the other three in the form of the Durahan, Zahn, and Joker, so that was nice to have a constant source of money and stat EXP flowing in, as well as some extra monsters I could use for future runs if I needed them. Of course, I also attempted the 4 Greats, the 4 tournaments required to access the final boss of the game, and although they were slightly tougher than the S officials, honestly, Smash could handle them just fine, being able to pretty much uppercut almost every foe in just one shot. Seriously, this golem was cracked. Well, okay, maybe cracked isn't the best adjective to use, but point being, he was really good. Honestly, my only mistake during this phase was the fact that I accidentally took a special training when I wasn't supposed to, which caused me to miss one of the Grade 4 tournaments. You see, these tournaments take place during the same week every single year, but you have to be at the ranch exactly 1 month before they happen in order to accept the invitation for those tournaments. I took the special training the week before the invitation, thinking I would be back before the tournament, but since the invitation never came, I missed my chance to participate, which basically forced another year on me to try again. I had an idea to remedy this, but quite literally a few weeks before the tournament happened, guess who decided that their fighting potential was met? Yeah, I guess it just wasn't meant to be for our Smash Overlord. Here's the thing though, even after your monster can't gain stats anymore, you can, in theory, still fight in tournaments and beat the final boss with that monster. You just, 1, have to have good enough stats to do it, and 2, freeze your monster immediately so he can be used in fresh condition for that next fight in particular. You see, if you go into town, in addition to retiring and turning the monsters into coaches, you can also freeze them in stasis at the studio and revive them at a future date and time, where in the meantime they will not age. This also kind of allows you to raise other monsters in the meantime, so you can at least, you know, do something productive meanwhile. However, I think I advanced too many weeks beyond Smash's limits, so when I did the final Great tournament, he had already reached a point where any future events he takes part in will give him a tired state, which means his stats get lower, and yeah, I was already not confident in his actual stats being enough, so losing more was not a great prospect for us. I did win the tournament though, but the final boss was a much different story. I mean, look at this comparison. My strength was amazing, but everything else, while not god-awful, just wasn't good enough to keep up with the Dynast Dragon. And believe me, I did try, regardless of this, but I just could not hit him, and he was hitting me pretty regularly for lots of damage. In one attempt, the dragon actually stumbled, which did actually give me a chance for some guaranteed damage and retaliation, but his high defense pretty much required me to not take any damage for the rest of the fight, and that sure as hell wasn't happening. So after a couple of attempts, I made my peace with the fact that Smash's run was over, so I made him a coach and started working on my next monster. I decided to use one of the special ones I earned from the invitational matches, so I picked Durahan, a knight in shining armor with really high defense. So I decided to make him my defense monster, where I would basically do the same thing I did with Smash, but focus more on defense than attack. I also named him after Sir Lancelot, but since he didn't have a lance, I decided to get a little more creative with his name, so say hello to Sir Swordalot. Swordalot's beginning was somehow rougher than Smash's. Yeah, he did have high defense, but he just didn't have great damage output or great moves to capitalize on, so he did actually struggle a bit. He also had low health, so whenever he did get hit by something, it took out greater percentages of damage to him than what I was doing to the enemy. Plus, accuracy was still a problem, so I wasn't hitting too often. And even when I did, it was only for very little in the process. It was going to be a bit until Swordalot would finally snowball, but that's just the way the cookie crumbles with this game though. It's certainly a process, that's for sure. I was basically in a perpetual state of increasing both attack and defense at the same time. I had intended for this strategy to be accuracy and defense, but clearly I needed more damage output to still make progress in the actual tournaments. Eventually I got to a point where I was finally able to take out the next couple of classes, and made it through the S class near the end of my 3rd year. Honestly, a bit further ahead of schedule than I thought I was. I also did this just in time for the last of the 4 great tournaments for that particular year, but I ended up making a bit of a risky play here by skipping that tournament. Don't get me wrong, I did try it a couple of times while resetting whenever I knew I wasn't going to win, but I kept getting an annoying golem enemy as one of my fights, and this guy could pretty much one-shot me, or, in my best case, almost one-shot me. I just could not get this guy down, and I was surprised that, despite having almost max defense, he was seriously doing this much damage to me. And like, I get it, it's a golem, a giant rock monster, it's gonna frickin' hurt. Heck, LT Smash was a golem for crying out loud. I know what these guys are capable of. But still, almost every other monster I fought wasn't doing that much, and it just didn't make much sense to me, with how much more inflated these damage values were getting. So I basically used my skip to have a few more key training sessions, and by the end of year 4, I was hoping to have not only max defense, but also max attack too. Eventually I got to December again, the tournament I skipped, and sure enough, look what enemy was there to wait for me. And I knew if I wanted any sort of attempt on the final boss, I had to do this here and now, because about a month after your monster's 4th birthday was generally when I noticed that the skill limit message would appear, and that was very close to arriving for me. After a few attempts, I took on Bastion the Golem once more, and this was what resulted from it. Ooh! I think I did it. I think that is just enough to get him. Hell yeah, let's do it. He did it. Sir Swordalot has officially done it. All 4 great tournaments were completed, which means he only had the final battle remaining. And he still had a few weeks of training left too, so more of a reason to increase his stats a little. I unfortunately didn't max his attack like I wanted to, but it was basically there. Defense was maxed at least, so even if he didn't do it, we at least had him lined up to be a really great defensive coach for the future runs. At the beginning of March, Swordalot did reach his cap unfortunately, and we still had 4 months to go, so I froze him until he was necessary again. In the meantime, I took out another monster I had planned to raise that I recruited from the invitational tournaments, and this one was a Zon. Zons are, well, they look like weird science experiment monsters. Kind of like Mewtwo from the Pokemon series, but more like Mewtwo plus 10 or something. As a result, I just called this one Mew12. Mew12's best stats seem to be speed and accuracy, so yeah, looks like accuracy is going to be this one's main trait. I only had a few weeks of training before Swordalot's title fight though, so I didn't get too invested in this guy's performance yet, but I was definitely curious to see how things would progress from him, when and if we got to that point. For the record, I still have Big Red the Dragon in my reserves, as well as another invitational monster I recruited, which was a Joker I named Bob for some reason. Plus, I had 2 other monsters I had received from miscellaneous game events, so even if these monsters continued to not be enough, I at least had some other options I could use for stat optimization. Basically, with my plan, at some point I would have had a 999 stat coach for each attribute, which means if I still couldn't beat the game by then, for whatever reason, I would at least have some tools at my disposal for each run getting easier the further I went in. Hopefully it wouldn't get to that point though. Eventually the big day came, and I swapped Sort-A-Lot back in to take on the Dynast Dragon. And well, let's look at how this first attempt went. Ooh! Yes! GG, baby! GG! Oh boy, I swear, the second I saw more than half of his health go away, I mashed that button like crazy. I knew that was my opening, and hey, it was risky, but it was more than worth it in knowing that it would have been all over right then and there if it worked. And well, it did. It worked. We beat the Emperor's Cup and the final boss of the game. The Agaima Corporation, which is apparently the corporation that helps us make these monsters and sponsors all the tournaments, celebrates with us in victory, and we have officially brought Zest and Aroma's ranch back to its former glory. And because we've made such a great new home here with our monster friends, we decide to stay here as well, leading to a happy ending for all. And with that, the credits roll, which means game complete. Wow. So yeah, this game did take a bit to complete, not gonna lie, but it honestly could have and probably should have taken longer. I definitely lucked out here in a few respects, not just because of game RNG or anything, but also just because I had the help of some people in chat who helped kind of steer me in the right direction with game mechanics. Also, just because the game is more than 2 decades old and has a few other guides online that I used as references as well. With these resources, I think I had an easier time with this than probably a beginner would. Honestly, that's probably my biggest problem with this game now that I think about it. It really throws you into the deep end here to try and figure out everything, and while I don't think a game should be super handholdy or anything, it could have at least tried to explain how the battle system worked, or gave more insight to what all the stats represent and mean. But yeah, not having all that intel or those explanations at first, I could see being a sticking point for people in this game. And again, gamers should be able to figure out stuff for themselves. I get that. I believe in that. But I think there was a bit too much that wasn't covered here, and it honestly should have. That's all I'm saying. Aside from that, I actually kind of enjoyed this game. It takes a bit to get used to, but realistically, once you're on a roll, it gets pretty exciting to raise your monsters and see how they perform in the later stages of their battle careers, and it becomes fun to raise different types of monsters to discover their most effective traits and abilities. Every monster I use seemed to have different strengths at their disposal, but along with those strengths also came individual struggles, and it kept me super engaged in figuring out how I would overcome those struggles and make progress in the process. And honestly, I did make some good progress in all of my runs. Even my first monster, when I had no idea what the hell I was doing at first, still made it to S rank, so that's at least something, right? So while restarting an entire monster's life cycle over again was pretty daunting, I still managed to stay pretty positive throughout, and I give the game a lot of credit for that. Oh, and for those wondering about the graphics and music, I honestly don't have too much to say about those. I honestly don't really remember the music that much, and I wouldn't say the graphics were that impressive, but they weren't terrible either. They were just kind of okay. Just very middle of the road, I think. I think it's time for the game scoring, so to start, for my overall game quality rating, I initially gave it a 3.5, but I think I am actually going to take it down to a 3 here. Overall, I think it works pretty well, but I do think it can be kind of a rough game for beginners, and I can definitely see a lot of people not really vibing with this game either. Not just because of the type of game it is, but also because there really isn't too much variety here either. There are hundreds of monsters you can apparently use and play with, but the problem is, so many of these monsters are just recolors of the same monsters, with some slight stat redistributions, or maybe a hidden trait of some kind. But for the most part, it's really just using the same type of monster again anyway, and I don't really see too many people wanting to experiment with every single type of possibility. Unless you're just really into that for some reason. Also, once you beat the game, there's not really any additional content either, so it basically just turns into, well, let's do it again and see if we can do the same thing with another monster, or something like that. And while I don't doubt that some people might have that type of mentality and would be into that, heck, I've even had that drive in other games myself, but I wouldn't say this game was one of those games for me. As much as I liked it, it still kind of felt like a one and done experience for me. That's basically what I'm saying here. Getting to personal enjoyment, I actually gave this a 4 out of 5. Because yeah, this was an enjoyable experience for me. Not perfect, but definitely and mostly positive. The fact that each of my monsters had some lore that went along with their fighting plots kept me and other members of the chat very entertained, and it was fun to see how everything came to be during, well, pretty much every stage and life cycle of that playthrough. I think ultimately what kept this from getting a 5 is just the fact that there was so much not knowing how things were going to turn out for each run, where every decision could have quite literally been the difference between success or needing to try again with a different life cycle. And since this game took me almost 18 hours, that was basically 6 hours for each monster cycle, and being in the middle of a challenge like GBAce, it just kinda added more unneeded pressure. One thing I said a lot during the playthrough was that this game is probably better experienced casually, and not for a challenge of this nature, and I think all the challengers who had played this game for their own respective series would probably agree with that. And finally, for difficulty, I gave it a 4 out of 5 as well. Like I said, one wrong move can mean the difference between success or failure in a monster's run, and taking the L can be a tough pill to swallow sometimes. It can also be fairly tricky to manage your time and events optimally, as sometimes the most random occurrences can happen which can really throw you off. Plus, it's just so hard to get a monster run going at first, since not only is it very weak, but will also have moments where it just will flat out disobey you and make itself easier to hit during a battle as a result. And sometimes you really feel like you need those starting battles to get things moving, so there were parts where RNG really felt like it played too big of a factor in success. And yeah, nobody really likes those moments, or at least they shouldn't anyway. Also, the attack accuracy system, yeah, it makes the RNG even more brutal. If you thought misleading attack percentages in Fire Emblem were bad, you've seen nothing yet here in this game. This can be just a really rough and tough game for beginners, and I am super fortunate I got the help that I did for this game, because I would have probably struggled for a really long time if I didn't. But yeah, that was my adventure of playing through Monster Rancher Advance, the first, but not only game of the Monster Rancher series on this system. We'll come back to this series with Monster Rancher Advance 2 later on, but who knows when the hell that will be. Until then, though, let's say our goodbyes to Age Island and make our way on to the next Game Boy Advance game. Speaking of which, let's take a look at the next game we'll be taking on for this series. Hopefully it's nothing scary. Well, I'm not sleeping at all this week. Okay guys, thank you for watching this summary. I really appreciate it. Don't forget to leave a comment and or like on the video, as those will really help me in these videos out. And stay tuned for future summaries of this series. If you also want to watch full playthroughs of these games for this challenge, check out the video description for a full playlist of everything that's been uploaded and exported so far. And if you're curious about what I'm playing right now for the challenge, be sure to stop by my Twitch channel to see what my current progress is. Just be warned, I'll be a lot further ahead of where we are for these summaries, so keep that in mind. This has been SlimKirby in the GBA series, and I'll talk to you fine people next time. Later, folks.